Only someone with agency can negotiate. The gap and reconciliation are often discussed together because it is assumed that Indigenous disadvantage is caused wholly by white colonisation, for example, through annexation of land and disruption of traditional social ways. Therefore, it is argued, the large gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous health, criminality and income can only be closed by initiatives coming from whites, meaning the nation, making reparations and otherwise undoing the harm their ancestors allegedly inflicted. See the second video in the present series. As noted earlier, such a narrative assumes that Indigenous people have had no agency, that their actions have had and continue to have no effect on their current situation. It is assumed that from 1788 until today, Indigenous people have been passive recipients of impacts coming from non-Indigenous people, that they are always the innocent, ineffectual party, and that the nation, especially Anglos, are the party bearing sole responsibility for present inequality, indeed for all negative Indigenous behaviour. Aborigines were faced with an overwhelming colonial force, but that does not mean they had no agency. This implied narrative is taken as an excuse to ignore causes of Aboriginal disability originating in that population. This might seem ridiculous, but it has dominant status among the cultural elites. Soviet-style rejection of biology, including the sciences bearing on human nature, is still influential in the humanities and the social sciences. Indigenous Australians could not resist British annexation, but they have always had agency. Accepting that a person or group has a degree of free action implies that they also have a degree of responsibility for their actions. We have already mentioned negotiation partners. If Indigenous people do in fact have agency, then they should be expected to meet minimum standards of dealing and settlement. Reconciliation can only be achieved between fair-minded people on both sides. Anglo-Australians cannot afford to involve bad actors in the process of forging a national settlement. They need credible, fair-minded negotiation partners with whom to work out a genuine settlement. Otherwise, an agreement will be unacceptable in the long term. The recognition of Indigenous agency also prompts us to examine the two slogans, reconciliation and close the gap. These catchwords are almost equated in public pronouncements by the Yes campaign because both are touted as prime reasons for installing a constitutional voice. These slogans are used to justify the transfer of power to a new regime of permanent joint sovereignty. It is incumbent on any serious participant in the voice discussion to analyse the gap and its causes as a means of assessing how reconciliation might be achieved. We cannot avoid considering hypotheses of major causes, including group differences in historical, psychological, behavioural and evolutionary factors. Unfortunately, Australian universities are not prepared to deliver such information because the humanities and social sciences are corrupted by intolerant utopian ideology and activism. Consequently, for many decades, they ignored or repudiated the vast body of knowledge concerning human nature, including individual and group differences. As a result, such knowledge bearing on Australian society is not up to date, consolidated or readily accessible. That is a pity, because the available data indicate that some Indigenous disadvantage in health is caused by different evolutionary histories. The gap is not closing despite the generous funding of Indigenous health and welfare programs over many years. The massive funding of Indigenous welfare programs is sustainable, but only if Indigenous people remain part of the nation. Australians understand that their Indigenous fellow citizens have special needs due to economic isolation in rural communities, long-term disruption of their lifeways by white settlement, and cultural differences. There is much goodwill among taxpayers, but their ability to pay is limited practically and morally. Expenditure on Indigenous programs has blown out due to lack of rational administration. Senator Jacinta Price points out that in 2016, only 8% of the 1,082 Indigenous-specific programs had been evaluated. Of those that were evaluated, the methods used were anecdotal and did not measure effectiveness. Price concludes that the close the gap industry has failed. Administrative irrationality begins with the failure to analyse the gap, meaning Indigenous disability. Poor Indigenous outcomes in education, income, childcare and criminality remain unexplained by government agencies. Instead, they and their academic consultants operate on the assumption of absolute cross-ethnic equality in cultural and genetic potentiality, an ideological tenet that might have been drawn from Stalin's Soviet Union. Indeed, as noted in an earlier video, the expert panel appointed by Prime Minister Julia Gillard actually cited a pro-Soviet ideologue writing in the 1940s. It is assumed that differences in outcomes must be due to externally imposed unfair disadvantage. The evolutionary causes of Aboriginal disability should be an area of inquiry in Australian social sciences. Instead, the topic is studiously ignored by university faculties to shield their students from the sciences of human nature. Consistent with Senator Price's remarks, it appears that ideological blindness has allowed race-guilt hucksterism to run amok. When universities' ideological corruption is overcome and the gap is subjected to serious analysis, it might be possible to make progress while reducing expenditure to a more sustainable level. Reconciliation should be a two-way process. Unfortunately, those Indigenous leaders who seek redress for past harms typically are not equally prominent in reciprocating the nation's generosity and fairness. If concord were the goal, demands for redress would be accompanied by expressions of loyalty to the Commonwealth. There would be no hint of breaking up the country or criticising national interests. They would attempt to heal or at least apologise when Indigenous people have placed unfair burdens on taxpayers. These burdens include high welfare and medical costs, the diminution of trust and safety in local communities and schools due to disorderly and offensive public behaviour, harm to property and persons due to extraordinarily high rates of crime, psychological harm against onlookers within Australia, and reputational harm to the nation in the form of embarrassment on the international stage. Aboriginal leader Nyong'ay Warren Mundine lists dysfunctions of many Aboriginal communities such as in Alice Springs. These include violence, especially rape and battery against women. They include theft, alcohol abuse, petrol sniffing and drugs. These social dysfunctions cause people to stay indoors to avoid the mayhem. Children need to be hidden from predatory males. Mundine points out that every government, both state and federal, as well as many media channels, have ignored the desperate reality of Aboriginal dysfunction. Truth-telling should also involve Indigenous leaders. They should cease blaming Anglo-Australia for all their ills and stop supporting those who cast that slur or who belittle the nation. In general, the ill will expressed by some Indigenous people needs to be opposed by any party seeking negotiations. They should not allow themselves to be used as battering rams by Anglophobes and others who would harm the Australian nation. Only when these attacks on the nation are brought within tolerable limits, at least by the negotiating parties, can the reconciliation process move forward. How can an agreement be negotiated with a people claiming collective rights when they refuse to demonstrate collective responsibility? A ceasefire in the culture wars is an absolute precondition for peace talks to begin. Something also needs to be said about financial reciprocity. This video has been arguing that any form of recognition, including a voice, should be designed and enacted equitably. That includes financial contributions. If Indigenous people have agency, should not those who participate in a voice pay some of its cost? After all, the proposed voice is designed to be a private ethnic good. None of its advocates have provided justification for having non-Indigenous citizens provide all the funding. What could be such a reason? Ex-High Court Justice Ian Callanan notes that the proposed voice would be paid for with non-Indigenous taxes. It will not be self-funding, and it will offer no direct accountability to the taxpayers who fund it. Callanan also asked whether participation in the voice will be voluntary and whether voting for voice office holders will be compulsory. Callanan's questions raise issues of fairness. It will be degrading for non-Indigenous citizens alone to fund what is meant to be a sectional lobby. The beneficiaries should provide a share, with a generous means-tested subsidy from the Commonwealth Government. Not doing so would be tantamount to treating Indigenous Australians as exploitative aristocrats or as childlike wards of the state. Making participation compulsory would also be improper, because it would remove free choice. How can self-determination have any meaning if it is made compulsory or is paid for by others? By enabling democratic choice of joining or not joining, the voice would rise or fall in legitimacy and influence depending on its acceptance among Indigenous people. This seems to answer part of the commentator Henry Ergas's criticism of the proposed voice. Ergas maintains that creating a racially defined body is necessarily divisive. He has a point, but any divisiveness would be softened if Indigenous people were given the option of choosing to belong to the voice or other bodies and categories. While someone should only be able to claim indigeneity if they can identify some threshold degree of ancestry, they should also be able to opt out of the Indigenous category due to self-identity or preference. Reciprocity should also apply to group apologies. In 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd apologised on behalf of the Commonwealth for the removal of many children from Aboriginal families. He said sorry to the stolen generation. In order to establish trust, Aborigines should apologise to Anglo-Australians, when appropriate, for transgressions committed by members of their communities, described earlier. An Aboriginal apology would not at all excuse instances of bad behaviour towards Indigenous people or nullify Prime Minister Rudd's apology, but it is surely reasonable that Indigenous leaders should apologise for patterns of bad behaviour shown by their own local communities. The principle of taking responsibility fits English philosopher John Stuart Mill's criteria for participation in liberal democratic liberties. Mill wrote in 1861 that, quote, "A people must be considered unfit for more than a limited and qualified freedom who will not cooperate actively with the law and the public authorities in the repression of evildoers," unquote. Furthermore, if Aborigines are to be treated as a nationwide collective interest group, then apologies are also warranted at that scale by their national leaders. If community leaders refuse to apologise for patterns of exceptionally bad behaviour that occur in places across the country, then how can they consistently demand to be treated as Indigenous representatives of goodwill? If the answer to that question is that a collective apology is impossible for organisational reasons, then it must also be impossible to organise meaningful consent to a treaty, voice or recognition. If Indigenous leaders will not or cannot apologise when their people behave badly, then let us call the whole reconciliation thing off. Negotiations should be conducted only with Indigenous leaders who are credible negotiation partners. We should only negotiate with those willing to take responsibility where appropriate. Furthermore, Indigenous leaders must deliver, at least to some degree. Saying sorry is nice, but non-Indigenous Australians primarily want the bad behaviour to end, or at least decline to an acceptable level. The rest of the nation will provide support, but Indigenous communities must solve this horrendous problem themselves. There are no excuses. If they request help from local, state and federal governments, the nation will answer yes. Community governance? Yes. Alcohol bans? Yes. Demands for sovereignty? No. Acceptance of a tax on the nation? Absolutely not. Responsible negotiation partners should also show consideration for the interests of all majority stakeholders, which means citizens as a whole, including the Anglo-core nation. And that will entail rejecting the anti-white component of the multicultural industry. Independently minded and responsible spokesmen should step forward. Unity between the nation and its Indigenous members should help, as would governments taking a stand and actively supporting patriotic Indigenous leaders. The combination would be powerful. At the same time, Anglos should demand inclusion in the referendum process and cessation of systemic Anglophobic exclusion and vilification. They should advocate for their own as well as for national interests. Only through full consultation can Indigenous recognition be conducted in a legitimate manner. The goal should be reconciliation through finding a settlement consisting of respectful mutual recognition. An example will close this statement. It is a revision of the well-known Acknowledgement of Country to include both Anglo and Indigenous Australians. Acknowledgement of the historic Australian nation. We acknowledge the Anglo explorers, pioneers and their descendants who planted the British flag and Western civilization on this continent, creating the Australian nation. We acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have lived here since the Dreamtime. And we acknowledge the Federal Commonwealth of Australia, created by the nation under the Crown, to guard the nation and the liberty of all citizens.